This is how NATO would most likely react in the event of an American invasion. The moment the invasion starts, NATO goes into full emergency mode, and the first hours decide whether NATO survives or collapses forever. An invasion like this requires an enormous movement of ships and aircraft across the Atlantic, and the world notices fast. It's the kind of operation that the US can't keep under wraps. Leaders and representatives of the various NATO member nations hurriedly convene emergency meetings and engage in frantic discussions, keeping close tabs on the situation as it evolves. They urgently seek additional information to help plan their response. Behind closed doors, one question keeps getting repeated over and over. Are they really going through with this? Their first objective is to attempt to talk America out of its invasion before it actually begins, all while US carrier strike groups are still crossing the Atlantic. Because once the first boots hit Greenland, there may be no way to undo it without a global shockwave, and time is already running out. Leaders of some of the larger, more influential NATO players like France, the United Kingdom, and Germany reach out to America's leadership and urge them to call the invasion off. They lean heavily on diplomatic tactics, insisting some kind of deal can still be worked out, offering to help America achieve its objectives in Greenland through negotiation instead of force. And they hammer the risks of military intervention, the near certain fracture of NATO, and the opening that it would create for rivals like Russia and China to exploit the chaos. Unfortunately, given that the US is already at the stage of sending jets and ships toward the Greenland coast, any calls for calm or de-escalation of the situation fall on deaf ears. America has made up its mind, and no amount of diplomatic sweet-talking is going to change that. And that is the moment NATO realizes something terrifying. The United States isn't negotiating, it is executing a plan. As a result, NATO needs to up the ante to have any chance of preserving its decades-old alliance and all the important security benefits that came along with it. And this is where things would get tricky. Once American boots are on the ground in Greenland, the sky is locked down by F-22s and F-35s, and the coast is sealed off by submarines and Arleigh Burke destroyers, NATO knows they are almost out of time. This initial phase is a messy mix of caution and chaos, and every decision NATO makes here can either prevent escalation or ignite it. NATO leaders don't want to make a bad situation worse. Many of them are deeply tied to the United States, and they're reluctant to risk trade, security deals, and decades of cooperation with the world's most powerful ally. No one wants to be the leader who accidentally turns this into World War III. The wider world also recognizes that America is the #1 military superpower of the age. It has the biggest and strongest armed forces in existence, the most advanced military technologies, near unbeatable assets in the air, at sea, and on land, and there are over 1.3 million highly trained active duty personnel, plus hundreds of thousands more in reserve, ready to lay their lives on the line in defense of America's freedom and pursuit of its military objectives. No other country can match the US militarily, which means NATO isn't deciding what's right, they're deciding what is survivable. No one wants to test America's firepower or provoke the nation with the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal, over 5,000 warheads in total. At the same time, some NATO countries refuse to be seen as folding as the US moves to seize an ally's territory in broad daylight. Many point to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which clearly states that any attack on a NATO nation should be viewed as an attack on the entire alliance. Every member of that alliance has a duty to act immediately and come to the aid of its ally. Article 5 has only ever been invoked once before, following the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. Numerous NATO allies came to America's aid after that tragedy, with soldiers from countries such as the UK, Denmark, France, and many others fighting alongside the Americans in Afghanistan. But that case involved an external party attacking a NATO member. This time around, it's different, and NATO has no playbook for it. This battle involves a NATO member, the most powerful and influential member of the entire alliance, attacking the sovereign territory of another. Some argue that Article 5 cannot be invoked in this instance, since the US is not an external force. With no precedent to refer to, NATO's leaders face an almost impossible test, one that could lead to the complete collapse of the alliance and bring about a complete shift in the global order. Why? Because NATO was built on the foundational assumption that the United States is the world's greatest guarantor of members' sovereignty and security. While members have their part to play, the US has always been the biggest player in the alliance. It is the driving force behind promoting peace and preventing conflicts across Europe and beyond. With the US invasion of Greenland, the whole premise collapses, and NATO collapses with it. An alliance built on shared rules and norms suddenly turns into something unstable, a defensive pact that no longer holds together. But that doesn't mean that NATO is all out of options. They still have levers to pull, just not ones people expect. As the US pushes forward, NATO's other 31 members have options, but they can't agree on which one to pursue. The stakes aren't equal for everyone. Canada, sitting right next door to the US, risks far more by breaking ties than the smaller European countries like North Macedonia or Latvia. Responsibility falls onto some of the alliance's most active players and important leaders to take charge of the situation. As the country directly impacted by the invasion, Denmark plays a big role in deciding on the eventual response, and it could force NATO to choose a side instantly. As soon as American jets enter the airspace over Greenland or armed troops set foot on its soil, it immediately sends a request for an Article 4 consultation, the precursor to invoking Article 5. Article 4 states that NATO members will consult together whenever any member's territory, security, or political independence is seen to be under threat, so they can assess the severity of the situation and decide on the next steps. In response, the North Atlantic Council, NATO's highest political authority, would enter a continuous emergency session, with leaders locked in intense and likely difficult discussions over what to do next. While major disagreements rage behind the scenes, NATO tries to present a united front in public, issuing the strongest statement in its entire history. It condemns America's actions outright and calls for rapid de-escalation. It is NATO trying to project strength while cracking internally. Members emphasize that the US has undermined everything the alliance stands for, turning its back on a long-standing ally, destabilizing Europe, and placing the future of NATO and the security of the Western world in extreme jeopardy. It's mostly symbolic and unlikely to change America's plans, but it still signals to the world that the rest of NATO is clinging to the norms the alliance was built on. The emergency sessions drag on, and all eyes are fixed on Greenland as the invasion tightens its grip. While leaders and representatives disagree on what comes next, the alliance still has to operate within its own legal framework. NATO members can't just form mini blocs and force through decisions that override dissenting voices. In practice, consultations continue until an outcome is reached that every member can accept. That is how NATO has always functioned, and in the past the system has usually worked. But this time, the same system that once kept NATO united might be what breaks it. Negotiations can be relatively quick and painless because members consult regularly and often understand each other's red lines long before a crisis. But they have never faced a crisis like this. Some countries call for the US to be immediately expelled from the alliance, but NATO has no formal mechanism to expel a member, and no nation has ever been forced out before. NATO also has no clear way to sanction one of its own members or authorize military force against one. That makes the idea of British, German, or Canadian troops landing in Greenland and aiming their rifles at American invaders almost unthinkable. None of NATO's nations want a war with the United States, but none of them want to sit back and let the invasion happen uncontested either. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, the alliance begins to fracture by the end of the first week following the invasion. NATO still exists officially and legally, but once members realize it has no way to respond to a crisis like this, individual nations start to act on their own. And this is where the punishments and penalties for America's actions begin to be dished out. Not bullets, leverage. Some countries simply don't have the power to make the US feel it, but others do, and they start applying real political and economic pressure to make America back down. Western European nations like France and the UK cut off intelligence sharing with the US and threatened to suspend long-running trade deals and broader security cooperation. Other European Union nations and their allies determined to respond go further, suspending defensive procurement contracts with US contractors. They also impose export controls on advanced dual-use technologies and critical components the US would need to sustain its invasion, including advanced semiconductors, aerospace systems, and specialized technology for Arctic and undersea operations. NATO and EU nations also get to work preparing targeted sanctions packages against any and all US officials who are found to have contributed to the decision to invade Greenland. This isn't Russian-style sanctions meant to cripple America's economy or punish its population. It is targeted pressure meant to exploit the interdependent networks that underpin transatlantic cooperation and to make any takeover of Greenland harder to sustain and far less valuable to the US over the long term. The idea behind it is simple. Limit America's strength, disrupt the invasion without firing a shot, shrink its influence by eroding the very systems it's used for decades to project power far beyond its borders. This is the modern battlefield: systems, supply chains, access, and trust. In essence, this is NATO's way of turning American plans upside down. An invasion meant to expand American power instead turns into self-sabotage, blowing apart the very alliances and agreements that made the US dominant to begin with. And the alliance's invasion retaliation campaign doesn't stop there. Even as fractures deepen, splitting the NATO family and pushing the alliance toward collapse, the most influential members and the strongest backers of Danish sovereignty press forward. They prepare to unleash the next phase of their plan: military punishments. This doesn't mean that they'll scramble jets or fire missiles at the US, but European governments can still take military action against America without actually needing to fire a single shot. America relies on these governments and countries to facilitate its vast network of global military logistics. The US has military bases and presences in nations around the world, including land forces bases, naval bases, air bases, and missile defense bases. These all play a huge role in allowing America to project power across the European continent and beyond. But once America breaks the bonds of NATO, its allies decide it's time for a change. Countries like Italy, Germany, Belgium, and the UK, among others, are well within their legal rights to impose immediate limits on US basing access. This cuts off American use of key facilities, airspace, and transit corridors. They also remove US officers from senior command roles within NATO and reduce or fully terminate rotational deployment agreements. It effectively slashes America's ability to project power halfway around the world. These moves don't necessarily require any alliance consensus. It's up to each independent nation to decide on how to govern its own territory and manage any American facilities on that territory. The US has enjoyed plenty of freedom in this domain, with many nations happily consenting to have US troops and assets on their land. But when these same countries start to see America as an unpredictable, unreliable aggressor rather than a steadfast, stalwart ally, they can easily and instantly change tack. And once that switch flips, trust becomes almost impossible to rebuild. None of these actions will necessarily end the invasion or convince America to deviate from its ongoing course of action, but they will have a big impact on a global scale. The US would still have the biggest military budget on the planet: Abrams tanks, B-2 bombers, F-35s. But overnight, its reach gets cut down. It can't lean on its presence in Asia and the Middle East the same way, and it can't just operate anywhere, anytime on its own terms. This signals a complete shift in the world order, with long-term American rivals like China and Russia seizing the opportunity to expand their own spheres of power and influence. While many NATO nations won't be too eager to see the likes of China and Russia growing stronger, they accept this as an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of America's actions. Some take the unprecedented step of seeking closer economic and political ties with China, which suddenly seems to be more reliable and worthwhile. It's not loyalty, it's survival. And in geopolitics, survival beats friendship every time. But in the weeks that follow, as the US continues its aggressive behavior in the Arctic, NATO takes things up another notch. As long as there's enough unity among all the alliance core members, they try to coordinate harsher economic sanctions, meaning to hit America harder than anything imposed so far. Europe and the US are huge trading partners, with the US exporting and importing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods and services every single year. Countries that take a hard line start to cut trade, cutting off the US not just from critical markets, but from huge parts of the global supply chain itself. The impact on the US is massive, because even with all its land and resources, America still depends on a global supply chain, on materials and manufacturing that it can't fully replace at home. Europe gets hit too, as does the global economy, and that only drags America standing down even further. But some NATO countries decide the pain is worth it if it means drawing a line against Washington. And as resentment toward the US grows, public support for tougher measures grows with it. But Europe also has another important piece of leverage to unleash: $3.6 trillion worth of US treasuries, which works out to around 40% of all America's foreign holdings. The US treasuries are spread across European public and private hands, but the EU can liquidate huge portions of those holdings. That would send borrowing costs in the US surging and shove Congress toward a full-blown budget crisis. European countries can also start selling off dollars from their reserves. If the rest of the world follows, the dollar would begin to slide, even until its status as the default global currency starts to look unstable. The months after the invasion trigger a rapid strategic shift across Europe. And this is the point where NATO stops being NATO as we know it. Even before this crisis, European countries had been ramping up defense spending after years of underinvestment and reliance on the US. Now that trend accelerates: higher budgets, new tanks and armored vehicles, more ships and aircraft, and an expansion into drones and cyber warfare, preparing for the next kind of battlefield. With America proving it can no longer be counted on after invading a trusted ally, the remaining NATO members accelerate these efforts. Many of the larger and wealthier nations are eager to improve their defenses and minimize their dependence on other countries as quickly as possible. Many of the smaller countries, meanwhile, begin to pose this question. If the US can simply seize Greenland by force, what's to stop them from doing the same to us? Fear spreads like wildfire across the map. As a result, they actively work on reducing their reliance on the US and forging stronger security alliances with closer, more trustworthy neighbors. The invasion might break NATO, but it can also forge something new, a stronger, more unified Europe, one with real strategic autonomy, heavier military forces to defend its territory, and continent-wide defense initiatives. This will allow the EU to rise from the ashes as a more formidable power than at any point in history. The damage to the United States, meanwhile, is severe in more ways than one. While America's NATO allies and partners almost certainly avoid direct military confrontation or any attempts to physically stop the takeover of Greenland, they still do everything in their power to make the US regret the decision and to punish the leaders behind it. And if the NATO alliance somehow survives the fallout, it does so in a new format, almost certainly without any US involvement. It moves to a more EU-first alliance, focusing purely on the unity, security, and mutual cooperation of European nations, leaving America to fend for itself. The invasion might bring short-term gains, territory, resources, and strategic leverage, but it also brings serious long-term losses. Because in the end, Greenland isn't the biggest prize here. The global order is. Now go check out This Will Happen If the US Pulls Out of NATO Day by Day, or click on this video instead.